My name is Susie Stern, and as chair of the board of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, JDCA, I want to thank the over 1,000 of you for joining today's emergency briefing, Israel at War, Democrats Respond, with our guests, Representative Adam Smith, Ritchie Torres, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz. I know we've all rejoiced at seeing Idan Alexander return to his New Jersey home after nearly 600 days as a hostage in the Hamas tunnels. And even as we focus on Iran today, we can never forget about the 53 remaining hostages still in wretched conditions in tunnels, and we will work until they are freed. Over the past week, the world has watched as Israel has aimed to dismantle and neutralize Iran's nuclear program, which possesses an existential threat to Israel and a grave threat to American national security interests. We at JDCA support eliminating Iran's nuclear weapon capabilities, and we stand with Israel as it faces war with Iran and support its right to self-defense. Specifically, we stand with the people of Israel, including so many of our own family members and friends who are currently under attack. We mourn the loss of the 24 Israeli civilians and pray for the recovery of the hundreds who suffered injuries. We believe the Trump administration must provide Israel with the resources it needs to ensure the security and defense of the country. Diplomacy represents the best path to thwarting Iran's nuclear program and countering Iran's malign behavior. And we welcome President Trump's announcement that he's giving 2 weeks for diplomacy to work before considering direct U.S. military strikes. If there's a viable path to resolving the conflict through diplomacy, it should be fully exhausted before the U.S. intervenes militarily. All of this requires strong American leadership, working with regional partners to prevent a broader regional conflict that puts the U.S. and Israel at further risk. Thus far, Donald Trump's policy, including his support for Israel's defense, has been a bit erratic. As he has said, no one knows what I'm going to do. That's an honest statement, which may even apply to him as he truly contemplates what's the next thing in this war. To help us understand how Democrats are looking at the complex set of issues before us, we're pleased to be joined by Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, Representative Adam Smith of Washington, and Representative Ritchie Torres of New York. Today's conversation will be moderated by JDCA National Leadership Member Daniel Silverberg, who is an attorney and a national security expert with extensive expertise in both executive and legislative branches of the U.S. government. Most of all, thank you all for joining us for this very important discussion. And with that, I'm pleased to turn things over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Susie. It's a pleasure to be with you all here. Congressman Wasserman Schultz, it's a delight to see you as always. It's not a delight necessarily under these circumstances. But I wanted to start with a personal question and a political question. You've been such a leader on Israel, Iran, Middle East issues writ large throughout your congressional career. And I think a lot of us are feeling ambivalence, shockingly, at what's happening right now. A certain kind of euphoria that finally the zit is being popped of sorts, that we are finally Israel's finally targeting Iran's nuclear capabilities and seriously degrading their potential to build a weapons capability. And at the same time, a lot of us are nervous that Donald Trump is at the helm of this. So one, on the personal side, would love your thoughts on how are you navigating this ambivalence? How are you thinking about it? And then two, on the political side, what you're hearing from your constituents, what's the predominant message? Thanks.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you so much to JDCA. It is always a pleasure to join you, and I would really love it if there was a time in the future in which we could come together for something a little more positive and could be discussing things that are about the Jewish community and all the incredible, wonderful impact that we have had, because we have, and just talk about how we're able to come together to make the world a better place. Unfortunately, we have state actors like Iran who want to do anything but, but Dan, ambivalence I think is the wrong word. I don't Gosh, I have constituents who are anything but ambivalent about what should come next. I mean, we have Iran, who has had its proxies long wage war on Israel and America, frankly, targeting us repeatedly. This preemptive strike, time to head off Iran's drive for nuclear weapons, has been a long time in coming. That's how I think people in my district, I know people in my district look at it. It's how I look at it. And I also look at this as a window of opportunity that has opened, that, you know, to just answer a personal question with a personal answer. I am worried that this is our shot. I mean, just to be very frank, this window is open now. Iran has been dramatically weakened. We cannot allow them to, we can't take our boot off their neck. We can't allow them to have to regroup and resurge. And I don't believe for a second that they have done anything other than race towards a nuclear weapon, and particularly during the go it alone exclusion, with the exclusion of Israel negotiations with Iran. We know that they were ramping up their program simultaneously, so they cannot be trusted. They never could be trusted. We have to continue to stand by Israel. We have to make sure that we aid in their defense, as our resources certainly have, and as we are with Iron Dome as it's being deployed. But I'm with you. Donald Trump can't be trusted. His support for Israel isn't genuine. He is a transactional character, and I mean, he cut Israel out of the nuclear talks. He cut them out. He sent Steve Witkoff to negotiate directly with Hamas without consultation with Israel. He cut a side deal with the Houthis that left Israel still vulnerable to their attacks. So we have to make sure that we, as much as is possible, render them neutered in this regard.
Understand, and that's helpful to hear. That, one, no ambivalence on your part. Two, let's take advantage of this rare moment in time with Iran. Can you give us a flavor of, in that never-ending challenge within the Democratic caucus on this issue, not just with Iran or Israel, but use of force generally? What are you picking up? What's the vibe? Mindful that I don't think the caucus has had a chance to meet since all of these developments have unfolded, but what are you hearing?
Right, we've been out of session for the last week, so most of this has unfolded during that time. I mean, I think we have a large number of our members that are aligned with the point of view that I have laid out. But I want to just be clear. I mean, obviously, we have to do these things. We have to make decisions in coordination with our allies, which it worries me that Donald Trump is so erratic and has so much disregard for our allies, including Israel, that I'm not sure how much coordination, if any, that will occur. And we have to have very specific goals. So in order for us to, I think, as a party, as elected party members from different districts across the country, any acceptable agreement has to ensure that Iran is never permitted to, or be capable of producing a nuclear weapon. They cannot be allowed to enrich uranium at all, or for it to be stored on their behalf in another country. Any agreement would, if there was one, that was designed in this supposed 2-week decision-making period that Trump is engaging in, the proxy terrorist activity has to be a part of any agreement. Supervised inspection, dismantling, removing of all of their infrastructure as well as the materials has to happen. But I mean, because if all of that is not part of whatever negotiation occurs, then all he's done by pulling us out of that agreement in 2018 is put Iran 8 years closer to having a nuclear weapon. And I say that as someone who voted for the JCPOA and was appalled when he pulled us out of it. And so the decision point that I have, and that I think many Democrats have that supported it, and this is where I would be advocating, is look, we didn't, the elements that must be included in any negotiation now that were not included in 2015 have to be there. I mean, you have to, this is a totally different situation now. I would never be supportive of anything, of any quote unquote diplomatic decision with Iran that didn't include the elements that I just talked to, and that I would encourage colleagues to be there as well. But, you know, we have a wing of our caucus that won't be for, you know, any military activity. But the danger that exists today with Iran weakened, you know, when you're in a weakened state, your the decision making can be less thoughtful, for lack of a better term, to the degree that the Ayatollah and his you know, his team around him are at all thoughtful.
Congresswoman, it's a great point about that if there is another round of diplomacy, God help us, all of the things that were out of the original JCPOA, let's hope they're in there, but we're talking about Donald Trump here. And so how do you...
And Witkoff, who initially came out on Fox News right after his first talks, that basically was proposing exactly what Donald Trump pulled out of. So this is amateur hour here. That is what is the most disturbing. He has a Secretary of Defense that he doesn't even consult on Iran because he's colossally incompetent, and why would you even take his opinion into consideration? He has a DNI in Tulsi Gabbard, who he shouldn't have trusted to begin with, who is, I think, more aligned with Putin than with any leadership in the United States, and who probably is either on her way out the door of her own volition, or they'll get rid of her. I mean, so the erratic nature and the uncertainty and our inability to have confidence in who is on the team making these, helping to make these decisions, makes this a much more tenuous and dangerous situation. And I just want to underscore, and my friend Adam Smith is, I know, going to come after me, and I heard him describe how he feels about this, and I have tremendous respect for his opinion. But we do have to be careful about, you know, considering the consequences, because, you know, Iran is certainly in a position to respond and react to whatever it is we do. We know we have potential activation of cells here in the United States that could do harm to Americans. We obviously have bases in the Middle East and within range of Iran. So all of those things have to be taken into consideration, and I know our caucus members will be very concerned about that.
And I heard you loud and clear saying no ambivalence right now on Israel's use of force, but there is a degree of ambivalence here around diplomacy to some extent, that what you are talking about requires, as you said, competence on the part of Donald Trump to execute.
Competence and savvy. I mean, Witkoff has absolutely, this is the lead guy that they are sending in to troubleshoot every crisis situation, when it's someone who has absolutely no diplomatic experience in doing that. Like, cutting business deals successfully does not mean that you can successfully negotiate with the most malignant actors in the entire world. Whatever trust they seem to have and confidence they have in who's sitting across the table from them in these discussions demonstrates how lacking they are in experience. But like, for me, because the JCPOA vote was the most difficult vote I've taken in my entire professional career, and I didn't make it lightly, but I can tell you that the elements that were in that deal that I voted for then, no chance I would vote for something that had only those components again. no chance, because the situation is much more volatile, much different. And we have to, like I said, we have to neuter Iran. They cannot, that serpent head cannot be able to rise up and strike again.
Congresswoman, thank you. Not just for joining us. Thank you for your leadership, your clear voice on these issues, and for your longstanding support of JDCA. We appreciate it, and we're delighted that you joined us. Thank
So
you.
much for having me. Okay, take care. Bye, everyone.
You too. Thank you. We're now honored to be joined by formal title ranking member, I'd like to say Chairman Adam Smith, not just to acknowledge his past leadership in the caucus on all national security and military issues, but our common confidence that Mr. Smith will be chairman once again with God's help. Congressman, it's great to be joined by you. Thank you for your leadership on this. We know that there are differing opinions within the caucus. You've expressed differing views on this as well. Having worked closely with you on throughout the Iraq War, assuming a lot of this comes from seeing the unintended consequences of when you use force. And so would love to get a sense of how are you seeing this right now? That question of ambivalence I asked Congressman Wasserman Schultz, I'd love to get your views on as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this conversation. And it's an incredibly complicated situation. It's not just about Israel and Iran or just Iran's nuclear program. The entire Middle East is now in a very different place, largely because of Israel's capable response to Hamas and Hezbollah and now Iran. The Iranian axis of support that they have is weaker than it has been at any point in decades right now, and that definitely creates an opportunity. At the same time, the conflict does run the risk of spinning out of control in the Middle East. Iran is weakened but not taken out, so we have to be mindful of what they could do to spin up that conflict. And then you've got some of the global issues here. Iran has been helping Russia and Ukraine. China has been helping Russia. North Korea has been helping Russia. So what do Russia, China, North Korea do? Do they come to Iran's aid to some extent? So we have to be mindful of making sure this thing doesn't spin out of control. But in the short term, I think one thing's relatively simple. We need to support Israel in their fight with Iran. In terms of military support, defending them against the missiles coming in, continuing the military support to them. At the same time, I don't think it would be good for the U.S. to directly get into this conflict. It would drag us into a war and into a conflict that I think would not be supported by the American people, would undermine our ability to go forward. So I think right now, Israel keeps up the pressure. I do think negotiations are important. Iran is weakened. This is an opportunity to drag them to the table and get a deal that's more along the lines of what Debbie just described and not just about the nuclear weapons. And the final piece, which I think Debbie hit very well, we're relying on the Trump administration to do that. And remember that they have not hired their national security team based on talent or even necessarily based on a specific policy. They've been hired based on, will they be loyal to Trump? And that leaves dangerous gaps in terms of the ability to negotiate a deal that is as complicated as this one is.
At risk of asking a terribly obvious question, you have a very different district than Congresswoman Schultz.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear what your constituents are telling you. I think you just answered it regarding serious hesitation for the U.S. to get involved in this conflict directly, but please.
Yeah, well, number one biggest thing that my district is telling me is we don't need more wars in the Middle East. And a lot of this is, the hangover from Iraq. We had very similar types of conversations prior to the 2003 war with Iraq. Now, it's a totally different situation. I understand that. I understand the threat that Iran poses, not just to Israel, but to the entire region. I mean, we are in the position where we might be able to help rebuild governments in Syria and Lebanon that are much more peaceful and much more prosperous if we get this right. And Iran is messing with that. But there is no appetite in my district. I don't think there's much appetite in the country for the U.S. getting directly involved in another war in the Middle East. Now, that doesn't mean that we just abandon the whole thing and let Iran do whatever they want to do, but it does mean that we better not stumble into a war and a conflict in the Middle East. So that's where my district is at on that. And the other big piece of it is the war in Gaza continues. And that is a significant problem for the Democratic Party right now in particular, but in districts in mine as well. And look, I think my district still is supportive of Israel, but they're also supportive of some type of future for the Palestinian people. In the absence of that right now, of any plausible path to something other than the war that is going on, does create tension and problems. Trying to negotiate an end to that would also be helpful. And just to be clear, that end has to be Hamas is no longer there. I do understand that, but that's putting a lot of pressure on us. Frankly, I think it's putting pressure on President Trump, because remember, part of what President Trump said, now let's keep in mind that he promised the absolute impossible. Remember, he was going to end the war in Ukraine on day one. He presented this image that his just natural strength was going to solve all of the world's problems, which was always utter nonsense. And now, 6 months into his term, it's absolutely clear. But nonetheless, part of what he promised was he was going to stop these wars. He was going to bring peace to places. So I think he's feeling that heat as well, that if you just keep upping and escalating and stumbling into greater conflict, the American people will not have much of an appetite for that. And that's not just in my district. I think that's something that is widely felt across the country.
How do you deal then with Congressman Wasserman Schultz's point that I think a number of Jewish community leaders have expressed of now's the window. There's not going to be a better time to degrade this program. Either provide Israel the mop to do it themselves, or Trump should do it. What's your take on that?
Well, my take is it's not as easy as people think it is, for a couple of reasons. One, they've got that site, and I don't know how to pronounce the mountain, so I'll just call it Fadro. Whatever, however it's pronounced. It's buried deep. It's difficult.
That's the old Assyrian pronunciation.
Okay. Well, all right. Pretend like that was a knowledgeable answer then. So, even if we hit it, are we really going to be able to get down deep and destroy those centrifuges? First of all. Second of all, Iran can reconstitute this program fairly quickly, which puts you in sort of an awkward space on a couple of questions. One, I think there is an implicit hope amongst many of us that somehow the Iranian regime, as it's currently constituted, will fall and we'll have a different Iran to deal with. I wouldn't put a lot of stock in that hope. Might it happen? I mean, if you'd asked me in 1986 if there was hope for the reunification of Germany, I would have laughed in your face, and I turned out to be wrong about that. Nonetheless, I would not put a lot of hope in the idea that somehow this war, internal dissent, and other things are going to topple the regime. Something similar to what the regime is right now will be there. Now, it could be dramatically different. They could, look at what's happened to them and see that they need to take a different path. Also, the Ayatollah Khamenei is old, for lack of a better way to put it, old and not in particularly good health. When he dies, who comes next? There's no natural successor. So I think there's an opportunity that the Iranian regime will be slightly different than what it is right now. But I worry that a lot of people are imagining, if he falls, all of a sudden the Iranian people will rise up and there'll be a democracy. And I don't think we should put our too much, as I said, hope into that. What we should do is take advantage of Iran's current weakness to force them to the table to negotiate a deal closer to what Debbie described a few minutes ago than what the JCPOA was. So I think that is where the push needs to be. I think, because basically, sorry, just to back up and walk through this, one, you could say, well, we're going to militarily put them in a position where they can't get a nuclear weapon again. I can tell you that probably shifts it from, weeks to maybe months or a year or two. It's not a permanent solution. It's just too easy. You can't unring the bell, as it were. Certainly the death of a lot of Iranian scientists make it more difficult, but they would be able to reconstitute the nuclear weapons program if they wanted to. The second option, like I said, would be the regime falls. I think the more realistic option is that we get the existing regime to the place where they do not want to pursue a nuclear weapon, and they recognize that their continued efforts to destabilize their surrounding countries are hurting them more than they are helping them. So I think we can take advantage of the current situation we're in to force Iran to get to a better deal than what we've had to date.
Roger that. And a key part of that, of course, is CENTCOM's support for Israel, CENTCOM's close alliances with partners throughout the Gulf. You're closer than probably any Democrat in Congress right now to DoD and to CENTCOM, and would love to get your perspective on kind of the politics inside the building, inside the Pentagon on this right now. Politico is reporting that Kurilla is running the whole show, that he has hawkish views on this and is informing President Trump's outlook extensively. What are you picking up, both in terms of what CENTCOM and DoD are thinking, and also what CENTCOM is doing vis-a-vis Israel's current campaign with Iran?
Yeah, no, I think that's fundamentally accurate, because going back to a point that several of us have made already, I mean, Pete Hegseth doesn't really know what he's doing, and I don't say that as an insult. It's just a fact. He's not been involved in these places before. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, he seems like he's a good guy. He has not been in this world. He's been out of the service for a while. He was in the Guard. So he just doesn't have the level of experience that General Kurilla and the CENTCOM people do. So if the White House wants advice on the ground, that's where they're going to go. And I think every CENTCOM commander I've ever known has had a really high idea of what we're capable of doing militarily. Sometimes that hasn't quite proven to be true. So yes, I think Trump is listening to Kurilla, and I think he wants to push and be fairly aggressive on this. So I think it's distinctly possible that Trump does decide to get us involved one way or the other in this conflict. Now, I do want to emphasize something I said earlier. We are supporting Israel in 100 different ways, in a variety of the different conflicts that they're involved in. I support that. I think it's good. And I think that one of the advantages we have is that General Kurilla has the relationships he has, not just with Israel, but throughout the region. It puts us in a strong position to be helpful to Israel with the fights, with what they're dealing with in Syria and Lebanon, with Hamas and Iran and all of that. But yeah, I think your summary is pretty good. There is more likely to be a more hawkish response, given that the experienced voices are coming from CENTCOM, and they tend to be more hawkish.
Copy. One last question for you, Congressman. What happens over the next 2 weeks inside Congress? Do you push for an AUMF, an authorization for use of military force vote? Do you push your Republican counterparts to hold hearings? What's your battle plan?
Yeah. I apologize, people interpret this right. I think what happens is, at the end of the day, the president does what the president wants to do. That's what's always happened with military interventions. And please don't misinterpret that as an endorsement of that approach. But it's just a fact of the way things have played out over the course of 200 plus years of history now, with the executive branch. Now, in the short term, Congress will be doing a lot. We'll be flailing around. We'll be introducing resolutions. We'll be asking for hearings. We'll be questioning what they're doing. We'll be urging caution. All of that will be happening. But at the end of the day, we don't have any control over what President Trump ultimately decides to do in this situation, except to the extent that it's a matter of persuasion, except to what I said earlier about where the American public is at. And for all of Trump's many faults, he doesn't like to be on the wrong side of the American public in his mind. Now, I mean, I think he is on the wrong side of them on a whole bunch of different issues. But if the American public is like, hell no, we do not want a war with Iran, I think that will have influence on his ultimate decision. So all of that sort of, waving of arms and complaining and resolutions and everything I just said is not irrelevant, in the sense that it could influence Trump's opinion. but we do not have the ultimate control in this situation, just given the legislative history.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your leadership, your support of the issues, both domestic and foreign policy, that JDCA cares about. Really appreciate your perspective and time. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. It's great to see you. Appreciate it.
Same. Same. And for our closing voice, we are honored to be joined by Congressman Ritchie Torres, who many of you know. And Congressman, you've been such a tremendous advocate for the Jewish community, for Israel-focused issues. And we just heard two very strong supporters of Israel with, frankly, somewhat nuanced, differing views on what to do here. So first, would love your perspective, and then would love your thoughts on how do we thread this needle within the Democratic caucus between those who say now's the moment to strike Iran, you go with the president you have, not the one you want, and cut off the head of the snake, and more cautious voices like Congressman Smith saying, you don't know what happens when you use force in the Middle East. We're burned by the Iraq experience. Let's not rush to get involved in a war here. What do you think?
Look, there should be nuance because it's a complex, combustible situation in the most volatile region in the world. But I do reject the analogy to Iraq. I mean, in the case of Iraq, we were invading a country and attempting regime change, and no one is proposing that the United States should invade Iran and put boots on the ground and attempt to install a Jeffersonian democracy. And I've seen elements of the far left and the far right claim that that there are lies about the Iranian nuclear program, just like there were lies about the Iraqi nuclear program. I mean, that's just false. I mean, the evidence that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon is overwhelming. I mean, in the last 3 months alone, Iran has grown the stockpile of 60% enriched uranium by 50%, even in the midst of diplomatic negotiations with the Trump administration. And that's not based on Israeli intelligence. That's based on the most definitive independent source, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And the same agency has found enriched uranium up to 83.7%, which is just shy of the 90% threshold for weapons grade enriched uranium. So there's just no evidence. There's just it's overwhelmingly clear that Iran is going through the process of enriching uranium and weaponizing enriched uranium. And the free world, the United States and Israel, have a strategic interest in preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Israel's a tiny democracy the size of New Jersey, and Iran is a few weeks or a few months away from acquiring a nuclear weapon that could wipe out much of Israel. Israel has a right to defend itself. For me, there's no greater act of self-defense than to defend your people from an existential nuclear threat. And the United States has a role to play in intercepting the barrage of ballistic missiles that have been fired at Israel at the hands of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you for that perspective. How do you deal with that question that we're all struggling with of, man, it is tough to have President Trump as the primary voice for pushing, not just the primary voice, the commander-in-chief responsible for executing the policies that you just described. How do you navigate that? How do you explain to your constituents your viewpoints?
Look, it's hard to navigate because just about every Democrat I know, including myself, has no confidence in Donald Trump, and he's been erratic and chaotic at a time when we need steady and stable leadership. But I try to think about what are the larger interests at stake. There's certainly a risk in the United States even surgically targeting the Fordo fuel enrichment plant. It's not without risk, but there's also a risk in Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, and we have to ask ourselves, which is the greater risk? And in my mind, there is no greater risk to world peace at the moment than an Iranian nuclear weapon. And if Iran were to combine a nuclear weapon with an intercontinental ballistic missile program, that would pose a threat not only to Israel, but to the security of the United States. And so I do feel we have an interest in being proactive in preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon.
I suspect that over the next 2 weeks, there's going to be some very interesting bedfellows in Congress, because we know that we already see MAGA, more isolationist voices are joining forces with far left progressives 24 hours into Israel's strikes, before there was even a question of the US joining, saying no support for Israel, resolutions of disapproval for US military force that didn't exist yet. And likewise, there could be some interesting alliances among voices like yourself with more hawkish Republicans who want to support the president. How do you think this unfolds? I doubt that President Trump is going to ask for an AUMF vote the way that President Obama did in 2013. But let's say he does. Let's say the president says, I want a letter from bipartisan leaders telling me to strike Iran. What do you do? What's your game plan the next 2 weeks?
Look, no one knows. I mean, it's an unpredictable situation, and there's danger. The longer the war drags on, the greater the risk to Israel. Israel obviously has a multi-layered missile defense system, but it's only Arrow 3 and to a lesser extent Arrow 2 and David Sling that have the capacity to intercept most of the aerial threats from Iran, and those interceptors are a finite resource. And so it's not as if Israel has all the time in the world to, it could eventually run out of interceptors, and the war could have a much higher death toll. So, time is of the essence. I think we have to make a decision about what's the best way forward.
And if Donald Trump theoretically says tomorrow, I'm launching a B-2 strike on Fort Dow, and the Democratic caucus holds an emergency session, and there's a family airing of, I don't want to say grievances, of differing viewpoints. You walk into that caucus room, what do you say? And I hate presenting you with a theoretical, with a hypothetical, but I want to get a sense of how you're going to deal with the internal caucus dynamics on this question of use of force.
Well, I think we should just start with the basic principle that Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, right? And so the question is, what's the best means of preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon, right? I think most Democrats would prefer diplomacy, but then if diplomacy fails, I think most people would prefer if Israel could do it on its own. It should. It's not clear whether Israel could decimate. I mean, we know for a fact that only the United States has the capacity to decimate the nuclear enrichment site in the depths of Fort Dow, right? We're the only country on Earth that has both the B-2 bombers and the GBU-57 bunker bombs. But are there alternative means of neutralizing that site? Could you target the power lines or the tunnels or the tunnel entrances, right? And if the answer to that question is no, then if the United States is the only country that could prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, then I would argue that as a last recourse, it's the only option left. When diplomacy is no longer an option, when Israel is no longer able to do it on its own, the option is either we prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, or we'll eventually develop a nuclear weapon. And Iran has been rapidly shortening the process of developing a weapon, and that's the concern.
Roger that. I noticed that when
again, there are no good options. Like there's a bad option and a worse option. The question is which option is bad and which is worst. And I would argue that the worst option is a nuclear armed Iran that existentially threatens Israel and ultimately threatens the free world, including the United States.
Are there
and we should do this historically. I feel like Israel's instincts on the issue have been historically right. In 1981, during Operation Opera, Israel kept Iraq from acquiring a nuclear weapon over the objections of the Reagan administration. And, were it not for Israel, Saddam Hussein would have had a nuclear weapon. In 2007, Israel kept Syria from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Were it not for Israel, Bashar al-Assad would have had a nuclear weapon. So, history tells us that Israel has been an effective force for nuclear non-proliferation in the world. And that not only benefits the Jewish state, it benefits all of us.
Let me ask you two additional, perhaps final questions here. One, just on a personal level, would love to, I don't think I've ever heard your personal story, Congressman, of at a moment like this, what is driving your strong and unwavering support for Israel, for which the Jewish community is tremendously grateful. And two, a tactical question. I noticed that when I was advising Congressman Hoyer when he was at the time Democratic whip during the JCPOA in 2015, we suddenly found that there were 435 mini nuclear scientists debating the number of centrifuges and
Yeah.
really getting into the weeds, which was great. It also meant that Congress writ large did not focus on other key foreign policy challenges. And right now, with the war in Gaza, with hostages still being held by Hamas, my tactical question to you is, what can JDCA, what can the Jewish community be doing, not just to be making our voices heard on Iran, but also to make sure that members of Congress stay focused on what else is happening in the world, starting with the war in Gaza. So one, your personal inspiration at the moment of what's driving your unwavering support, and two, the tactical question, what can we do to make sure people don't lose focus on what else is happening in the world and in Gaza? Thanks.
Well, I think first and foremost, I take the position that I do because I feel it's morally the right thing to do, and I believe in it deeply. I feel it deeply. I've been, traveling to Israel for about a decade and thinking deeply about the subject. And I asked myself, what would we do if we were in the same position? Iran is only a few weeks away from a nuclear weapon that existentially threatens Israel. And I'm convinced that any country in Israel's position with Israel's capabilities would do exactly what Israel's doing. Like Iran is the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world, providing significant support to terrorist organizations like Hamas, the perpetrators of October 7th. Iran is a threshold nuclear state with a stated mission of wiping Israel from the face of the map. And so it's just obvious to me that the aggressor is not Israel, which is simply defending itself from an existential threat. The aggressor is the Islamic Republic of Iran and its empire of terror, which is stained with the blood not only of innocent Israelis and Americans, but innocent Muslims and Arabs. Iran had a role in propping up the Assad regime in Syria and in financing the Syrian civil war, which had a death toll of 600,000 people. The civil war in Yemen, a death toll of 400,000 people. And so there are hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of Muslims and Arabs who have been the victims of Iranian aggression in the Middle East. And I'm convinced that peace in the Middle East has no greater friend than Israel, and it has no greater enemy than the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I'm cautiously hopeful that the future of the Middle East belongs to Israel and the Abraham Accords, and that we are as close as we've ever been to realizing what I call the Abrahamic dream of a world where Jews and Christians and Muslims, where people of all faiths can coexist in peace and prosperity. So that's the ultimate vision that animates me and motivates me to fight as passionately as I do for the U.S.-Israel relationship and for peace in the Middle East. And then I deeply value the relationship with JDCA because you represent the intersection of Zionism and liberalism, and I see JDCA as one of the greatest champions of progressive values, not only here at home, but abroad. But part of what is distracting us is Donald Trump. He is so flooding the zone with abuses on our democracy that we have trouble focusing on the complex constellation of challenges that we're facing internationally, whether it's China, Russia, the Middle East, the war in Gaza. We still need to bring the hostages home. There are hostages who have been languishing for an endless amount of time. So I just want to thank JDCA for keeping our focus and priorities in the right place.
Congressman, the appreciation and dare I say the love is mutual. So thank you. Thank you for your leadership and your perspective today. Really appreciate it.
Good to see you.
Same. I'm now going to hand the floor to our great leader, Haley Seufer.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you for moderating today's discussion. It was a great discussion that represented, I think, a nuanced range of views among Democrats, but one thing was very clear, and that is the overwhelming support for Israel's security and right to self-defense that exists among Democrats. I'm Haley Seufer, JDCA's CEO, and I want to thank all of you for joining, as well as Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, Congressman Smith and Torres, and each of you. It was an enlightening and interesting conversation. As American Jews, we have a deep connection to the Israeli people, and it's led to a shared sense of pain, anguish, and terror as Iranian missiles have rained down on Israel, hitting population centers in the past week. Many of us have reached out to our family, our friends, our fellow Americans in Israel to offer support. And our concern for what's happening and the war is personal. So I'll share a personal story with all of you. Last Friday, I reached out to a close friend of decades in Tel Aviv via video, and I saw and sent a message to everyone in her bomb shelter. It was a cement room that was sparsely furnished with a few plastic white chairs and a television. It was crowded, it looked hot, it looked uncomfortable. And I've continued to think about my friend, her son, her family, and her entire apartment building crowded in that room each day and many sleepless nights since. Every Iranian attack on Israel is bringing a sense of dread and fear about those missiles getting through Israel's very sophisticated missile defense systems, landing in population centers. And I know I'm not alone in sharing that concern. We are deeply concerned about everyone in Israel, and as well as the 53 hostages still in captivity in Gaza. And the best thing that we can do in this moment is to stay informed, to come together as a community, to advocate for our values, and to channel our energy into action. And that is what we aim to do at JDCA. So here are 2 ways that you can get involved. First, you can join our community by becoming a member of JDCA. Last week, we had 48 meetings with members of Congress. With our members, we brought our views and our values to Capitol Hill with hundreds of you. And as a JDCA member, you're invited to join such opportunities. So if you're not yet a member, please consider becoming one or increasing your membership level if you already are to support our work. JDCA members also gain access to additional programming, and we do have a program coming up to further look at this war with 2 of the foremost experts. We'll be joined by former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Dana Stroll and former U.S. Ambassador to Israel Dan Shapiro on Wednesday, June 25th at 12 p.m. Eastern. So please join us as a JDCA member. The second way to get involved is to follow JDCA on social media, all the social media platforms where you might be active, including Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, Twitter, Substack, TikTok, YouTube. We're there. There you'll see our messages on all of the key issues that are facing American Jews. You'll see my weekly commentary, which is coming out within the hour. Today's is entitled The Multi-Front War Facing American Jews. And you can find us, again, on all of those platforms. We encourage you to share our posts to help get a message out. We know that is where people are getting their information and their news. And so please do follow us on social media. We'll also be providing you with specific ways to take action with your members of Congress. And we wanted to thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of our community. We will continue to keep you updated on events as they continue to unfold. And we wish each of you a meaningful and peaceful Shabbat Shalom. We hope to see you soon.